Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Women Leaders in Global Health Conference. I'm Sapna Kedia, and I'm super excited to be moderating this panel on representation matters, elevating women's voices in popular culture and in the media. With me, I have some amazing media personalities from South Asia. I feel very honored to be having this conversation with each one of you. The first thing that I thought of when I was invited to moderate this panel was that, okay, this is a conference on global health. Why is there a panel on media? Right? And then as I started reading up more and as I sort of tried to organize my thoughts more, I realized, of course, you need the media to represent our voices. You need the media to highlight global health issues. And that's why we have this panel today. And also, more importantly, when we look at this media today in South Asia, and I think I can speak for the world, there are two main issues. One, there is sparse reporting on women's issues, right? And the way it's reported, these issues are often done in a judgmental manner. It's like an afterword, like we hear in our government, whenever we talk about women, it's women and child, it's never about women. So usually women issues are covered like that. Secondly, there is a complete lack of leadership positions for women in the media industry. And we have some statistics around that, and we can share some links. But there's a report on South Asian women in media, and it says that the leadership positions held by women are less than 20%. So that is something that we need to think about. And within the media, there are issues of pay parity, there are issues of gender-based discrimination, there are issues of sexual harassment, and there is general issue of gender-based discrimination. So given all of that, I think it's very befitting that we have this panel. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists with all of you. We have with us today Anubha Bhonsle, who's the founder of a digital platform called NewsWorthy. Thank you, Anubha, for joining us. We have with us Shaili Chopra, who's the founder of the She the People TV. Thank you, Shaili, for joining us. And we have with us Munizae Jahangir, who is the founder of VoicePK.net, and she's also a documentary filmmaker. And we have with us Jaya Luintel, who's the founder of Story Kitchen in Nepal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think this panel is going to be a mix of professional questions and also personal, because I think we're all here in the capacity also as women. So I think my first question would be to any panelists who'd like to begin. My first question is that given the conference is on global health, why do you think that women who are reporting in the media, whether on health or any other issues, need to be a part of this conversation? If Anubha, if you'd like to begin.
Sure, Sapna. Thank you. Thanks very much. And I'm happy to be here amongst friends and fellow journalists and colleagues. Together we row this boat in some ways. Sapna, sort of a broad arc to your answer. Women need to be everywhere. Women need to be a part of global health. Women need to be part of conversations on diplomatic relations. Women need to be part of conversations around business. So women need to be everywhere. I think the irony of my answer is the fact that we've had to hold a conference of sort of foregrounding women leadership in global health at a time when some of the best reportage on this pandemic, not just in India and South Asia, but across the world, has come from women journalists. When women leaders in 7 to 8 countries have been at the forefront of nations that have performed better or handled the pandemic in a better manner. When several organizations at a global level that are foregrounding health, including the WHO, are being led by women. When our community health workers that are going door to door, spreading information about the pandemic, about reproductive rights, about immunization are actually made up of women. In India, we call them ASHA workers, whose work is actually considered whose work is actually considered more of a sort of a gesture of service rather than a profession, right? In spite of all this, we are having to have this conversation, which only goes on to say that women are really at the forefront of each of these activities, but their work is invisibilized in many ways.
Thank you, Anubha. Shaili, would you like to answer?
Sure. So I think, Anubha set a good context in terms of the kind of leadership we've seen, the kind of reportage we've seen. But I think also you deep dive into the reportage, that's happened on the pandemic. And one of the big gaps is how little we know about the impact of COVID on women. How little we know about the impact of COVID on a woman outside of the disease itself, and how little we know about research being done, if at all, on how a pandemic sort of impacts women beyond its actual core. So I think that's one part of it in terms of where I think women are absent from the broader purview of looking at healthcare and its impact on women. But if one looks at coverage itself, I think, these things are very, very deep rooted. And it goes back to something that we're very familiar in, for example, in India, when farmer suicides happen. It's something that is widely reported, and we never put a gendered lens to it. So we hardly report on the women who are left behind after the farmers are dead, and the plight that they go through. And I think that's mostly true for all health oriented, health related sectors, diseases. Look at research. So that's one very, very critical part, which is that we forget to look at gender as one specific lens when it comes to covering health, nutrition. Some time ago, I did a documentary with BBC Horizons, and I went down to Bangalore to look at a company that was creating fortified food for kids. And the entire recipe of that fortified food was based on, what the demands of men are. It forgot that young girls suffer from calcium deficiency, for example, and that they should look at fortifying it with more calcium. So there's one bucket of it which is very, very core to how the health sector approaches the idea of sort of fulfilling gaps when it comes to women and their needs. And then the other side of it is the entire media coverage piece. Today, as we see it, and I repeatedly see this as we cover health-related stories on She the People, is that mostly it's lack of things occurring to people when they're on the street, on the road, trying to cover this. Somebody asked me the other day that increasingly, when you have a platform that's trying to focus on women specifically, are you not taking them away from gender equality? The concept of gender equality, the concept of conversations or having conversations on leadership in any sector have just been so male dominated that there's been need to introduce conversations that specifically spotlight women. Because when you don't do that, the status quo is all male, right? Or majority male. And I think that's seeped through in the healthcare sector in a very, very significant way. Another fallout of the concept of health is really what happens right after let's say a pandemic or a disease breakout. For example, we're already talking about the kind of impact women are going to see in terms of jobs, in terms of familial responsibilities, in terms of domestic abuse and violence, all in the aftermath of this COVID, which is a central healthcare issue. But at the end of the day, it's turning out to be something else when it comes to women. So I think there are many, many strong correlated linkages that we are yet talking about in this pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting such important issues. Munizae, would you like to add? You're on mute.
Sorry. Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this very, very distinguished guest of panel and this very prominent panel, and such an important, I think. I think some of my colleagues already said it. They said that, women have to be a part of a conversation, whichever conversation it is. But I do think that in the COVID related, the 6 months that we were under lockdown, at least in Pakistan, or 7 months that we were under lockdown. I'm also on the board of the Asma Jahangir Legal Aid Cell, and we saw a rise in domestic violence cases for women. And we often saw that we had cases of women who were being turned out of their husband's home, and they really didn't have anywhere to go. For example, shelter homes were closed down, and they were not allowing other women to come in. And so there were a lot of women who would otherwise have places to go to. Maybe a relative would open up their home or something, but a lot of them found themselves completely alone. So I think that increased. There was frustration, people were losing their jobs. It was coming out in ways where we saw a rise in domestic violence. We certainly saw that. I also think that children suffered, simply because I do believe that the mother and child's rights are intrinsically linked. And when women were turned out of their own homes, etc., the children actually suffered. We also saw that in certain cases, for example, I also believe that women's rights is intrinsically linked to democracy. We saw nurses go on strike, but instead of the government actually turning around and giving them any assurances, they were arrested. And they had gone on strike to ask for PPE equipment, which was necessary at that time, and they were not being given that PPE equipment. But they were arrested at that time and thrown into jail. Um, so I think that in many ways we have to look at society not just as what is happening to women, but really what is happening around them. And does it enable an environment where the weakest segment of the society, which happens to be women, are protected? That the most vulnerable section of society is protected? And in this case, COVID actually made things much worse for women, not just in terms of them earning a livelihood. For example, I'll give you a small example. We did a story on students. All the universities closed down. So students who were coming from far-flung areas, even conflict areas between India and Pakistan, whether that's Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan, and far-flung areas of Balochistan, they didn't have access to internet, and they only had access to internet through a smartphone, and that one smartphone would be shared by the entire family, and the young woman would be the last person who would get an opportunity to attend her classes online. So all these women kind of fell out of the race, and already the race was hard, but when COVID happened, they were the last priority.
Thanks, Munizae. Jaya?
Thank you, Sapna. I'm so glad to be here, sharing this platform and sharing about our experience, the work that we have been doing on the ground, and bringing it to the global audience. I really feel that not only, as women, not only we need to be part or we have to be part of this, we should be leading this conversation the way we are doing now. Because as my fellow colleagues already mentioned, that women are at the front line of the health services. And also, if we look into the overall issue, the most traumatized, the most vulnerable group are the women in terms of health and well-being. So as media is the mirror of society, and it is a space for people to amplify their voices, and a space in which they can through which they can give visibility to their pertinent issue. So as a media, and as a media people, particularly women working with the media, we should be leading this conversation, and we should be part of this conversation at both level. Because sometimes when we just lead, it just gets discussed among us, but it should be at the both level. That is what I feel. And if we also look into the data from Global Media Monitoring Project, they do survey in every 5 months, and the latest data is yet to come. But again, if we look into the data from 2015, the issue of science and health occupies only 8% of the overall news space as a news agenda. So we can see like how shrinked space it has been given, and they are putting science and health together. We are even not talking about the health specific issue. And within this news space, within this news space, like 8%, 35% of the people in news under this topic, which is science and health, they have put it both together, are women. So only 35 women's issues are coming. And if you look again into these news issues, news coverage, then only 14% stories have women as central focus. So we can see, even from this data, how the media itself, though we are fighting for the fighting in our own space, how to bring all these issues, but within media as well, how women are being silenced, and how their health issues are also being silenced. So this is the scenario. That is why we need to be part of this, and not only part of this, we should be leading this conversation, and others should also join us in this conversation. Sapna.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for kickstarting this conversation by raising very important issues about why women's stories need to be highlighted, why the impact that the pandemic has had on women's lives beyond the pandemic period needs to be highlighted, and why women should be presenting these stories to the world. So, thank you so much. I think a little bit, because you're all female journalists and you're all sort of into reporting and you're leading platforms. I think one another question that comes to me is that how's the journey of a female journalist, female reporter, female editor different or unique in comparison to her male counterparts? That's one. And I think the second part to that would be, how do male colleagues generally respond? We spoke about gendered coverage of news, but also just gendered responses to female journalists, female editors, and how their career trajectories are different or unique to their male counterparts. Jaya, would you like to go first?
Yes, Sapna, when you were asking this question, I was just thinking about my work. I started my work with Nepal's first independent Radio Sagarmatha. It was back in 1999. And Nepal's independent media history is fairly young. It started from after 1990s, when we had democracy. We were able to establish democracy. So it is fairly young. It is just, around like 30 years. And I started working with the radio station, which was the first independent radio station in Nepal. And at that time, I remember I worked in the newsroom, and at that time I remember it was for the first time I started a radio program, a magazine, in a magazine format, which talked about gender equality, women's empowerment, uh, and it brought the issues of women from rights-based approach in the radio program. And before that, there were radio programs which were targeted to women on the radio, but those radio programs were mostly focused on skills development and welfare approach. And institutionally, the radio program that started in 2002, that created a kind of movement in the radio sector itself. And when I was working in the newsroom, sometimes it was very difficult for me when I went out for the reporting. It was very difficult for me to find another fellow woman journalist. It was very difficult. And sometimes if I find, I would feel that, okay, I'm not alone. That was the situation at that time. And now the situation is, I would say, the situation is not getting better, because we really want it to be better, and there should be more women. So recent data from Federation of Nepalese Journalists in Nepal, there are only 18% women journalists. So you can see like how huge is the gap. The gap is, and if you go deeper into this 18%, it is because the number is little bit going higher, because there are many more women coming to work with the radio station. Because of the independent radio movement in Nepal, the number of female journalists, the number of women journalists is increasing. But again, if you look into the mainstream media or print media, then it is very difficult to find women journalists working in the newsroom, and particularly in the leadership position. There are like many Delhi broadsheet in Nepal, but we don't have one editor in those Delhi broadsheets. There is only one woman editor in a weekly broadsheet, and there is one recently who was recently appointed in government run newspaper, but again she has to fight with the internal politics is there, and she has been fighting. She has filed the case at the Supreme Court. So there are like so many issues we need to fight. Even sometimes we say that we are there to fight for others, and we are there to bring the issues of others, but sometimes we feel that we are already trapped within this patriarchal structure of our media institution and media environment in our own context. And I would see that the number is gradually increasing, but it is not even at the satisfactory level. But again, as the number is growing, women are facing so many hurdles within the media sector and within the media house they are working with. So this is my observation that comes from my own experience, Sapna.
Thank you, Jaya. Munizae, would you like to add to that? You're on mute.
Sorry.
No problem.
We still have to get used to it. I much prefer meeting people, and this is the new virtual. We have to get used to it. But I just wanted to say that when I began my career reporting on Afghanistan, and my first documentary was on 4 women, and I depicted the conflict in Afghanistan through their eyes, and they were from different ages and from different ethnicities and backgrounds. And at that time, there was a consensus amongst the world that the Taliban have subjugated women and therefore they are bad and must be defeated. And now, so many years later, 16 years later, we sit and they are now negotiating with the Taliban, saying that they are a reality. And the first thing that's going to be negotiated away is going to be women's rights. So I feel that we are entering an era in South Asia, at least, where we are going to see women being subjugated in Afghanistan, and it will have a ripple effect on extremist forces in Pakistan, in India, and Sri Lanka, in the rest of South Asia. And I feel very sad, but hopeful also, because I feel that the Afghan women have put up an amazing fight. And I think that they will continue to put on that fight. What I fear is that they are not getting the support that they deserve from the rest of the world, especially the women of South Asia. So I think that my journey began by telling the stories of women, and I felt that that was never told. So when I started reporting, I would always get the women's beat. Naturally, I wanted to also become a hard-nosed reporter. So I would choose conflict areas, and I would go to Taliban, infested areas, and report from there and tell the women's stories. And I used that as an angle to convince editors who were very reluctant to send me there to report on these issues. And I think that there are very few women reporters actually in Pakistan. There are lots that you will see on the screen. They will read the news for you. They will probably do a talk show for you, but they will not be sent outside in the field to report. And I think that's where the real stories are. So I think that is still a very big challenge, because it's such an insecure environment. And I was extremely lucky because I had very supportive family, and I was working for NDTV at the time, and they said, just go do your thing. But I don't think that that kind of support exists in Pakistan in every household or in every newsroom. At the same time, like my colleague earlier said, we have just one editor. We have so many. We have over 46 TV channels, so many newspapers, much more than in some ways India as well. However, that one editor is basically, she inherited it by birth, because she was born into a family. So we are the only actually portal or digital media platform run by 2 women and founded by women. And we do focus on women's rights issues on voicepk.net and on minority and issues. And I think that there has to be a change. When women talk about women's issues, they don't just depict the woman as a victim. There is much more of a broader story around the women. I mean, she is a full picture, and there's 360 degrees around it. There is a struggle to her. And I think the way women will tell the story of a woman will be very different, because there'll be very different sensitivities involved in that. So therefore, I think that there is, and it is changing. I also feel that it is changing, and I hope I'm not going over time, but I feel that I wanted to tell you a little bit of what's happening in Pakistan. Recently, there was an open letter that was written by women journalists to the government of Pakistan, saying that we are being harassed online, and a lot of young women actually put their names on it, including myself. And at that time, when the young women, they said we have to move this letter, they were my age, but they hadn't gone through the reporting drill. I looked at some of the things that they were saying, and I said, well, that's been happening to us for so many years. And they said, yes, but that is not the new normal, my dear. You're crazy to think that that's the new normal. You are not supposed to get groped. You're not supposed to be abused on Twitter. You're not supposed to be teased on Twitter. So I felt that we had gone through it so much that we had become almost hard. And I think that the younger generation, and I'm very happy to see it, will not take that kind of abuse. And that is, I think, the hope for women journalists, certainly in Pakistan.
Thank you so much, and I will come back to you when you mentioned that women journalists are often not sent to cover hardcore stories. It's usually social issues, and it's all usually skilling shows where you learn how to cook better, stitch better, do your hair and skin better. So we'll come to that. Shaili, just to sort of take the conversation a little ahead in terms of how your experience as a female business journalist has been in comparison to your male counterparts, and also just in terms of these struggles that women go through in the media industry in terms of getting the kind of stories that they want to report, in terms of being in leadership positions. What do you think is changing, and what do you think needs to change further?
Thanks, Sapna. I just wanted to add two aspects on journalists in India. I feel that things have changed over time a bit. We do see our male counterparts being accommodative, which is which is a word I use with apology ahead, in the sense that I think women have just realized they've got to jostle their way in. And that's been their story. And I recognize every single woman who's gone ahead and done it. Because, if women didn't raise their hand or reach out there and say, I'm going to do it like Munizae did or Anubha did, for their own careers, for reporting on in places that were otherwise considered dangerous, etc. I think we would have not had enough inspiration, or even for the men in the system. So I feel in India, there's also been a great amount of democratization with the onset of digital. Even though we don't have enough female owners, we have finally seen female editors. And yes, it's questionable whether, the person who handles the money is really sort of taking all the calls. But I feel that it's heartening for me to see from the time that I was a journalist to where I am now, that there are female leaders of traditional channels, they're female leaders of breakthrough channels, whether it's what we are doing with She the People or those who are doing in social impact and various other spaces. Anubha here, for example, has built a digital channel herself. So I think that's very heartening to see. We don't necessarily have to wait to be permitted to become something. We're just claiming the space and becoming that, right? I think the second part is that for men and coverage, men in journalism are not a completely different breed like they are anywhere else. So do many men get intimidated by women who want to go out there and don't believe in some sort of bias and how and what needs to be reported? Oh, absolutely. So I think we've had our share of enough editors. I remember moving to a channel after NDTV when one of my editors said, don't think you're going to occupy the corner office, that remains mine. And I was thinking, what an insecure guy, right? I mean, there's no dearth of such men in journalism, and we continue to see them far and wide. But I think what I find also very powerful about the idea of women taking on, journalism in an innovative way is that they have become the creators of platforms. So you don't need to, adhere or wait for something to sort of turn a page on what is supposed to be gender equality within an organization. Now, it is an important factor what we women do with what we have, and how we are going to empower other women and lift them to go to the next level, which is also reflective of the more you see women in the space, in the media space, the more I think we're going to raise questions that need to be raised. For example, we are here at the women's health conference. One of the big challenges on women's health is the lack of women speaking to other women, the lack of moms speaking to daughters, the lack of mother-in-laws talking to their daughter-in-laws, and all across. And why is that? There are no men interfering with this, right? But patriarchy is a condition. It's a system against which everybody is trying to sort of find their way out. So I think that when one looks at coverage, it's not always men versus women, and particularly in health. And that's been my experience, because one of our new series has been talking to women, young girls, about questions they have but don't know where to take them. It's called Girl Talk. And I'm very surprised the kind of questions that come to us in direct message, whether it's about menstruation or having a resentful mom who doesn't want to talk about it, or doesn't, have somebody who talks about diseases related to women particularly. So I feel that there is a massive, massive gap that we are not recognizing today, even as we talk about coverage of women and women health issues, that the fundamental problems are very significant, and they involve women just as much as they involve men. And of course, when you have conferences, for example, would be nice to have a man here discussing with us what he is doing about women's health and how he's changing the dialogue by putting more women's health on what are traditional organizations, for media. Because some of us are really doing this for years. As a business journalist, I think I barely met one or two female CEOs a month. It's possible that most of my guilt really forced me to get out there and say that, listen, this can't be real. I mean, the business world may be male dominated, but it's not like it's not got women running it. So I think we need to start recognizing that while women need to break a lot within places where it's male dominated, we need to pull those men into conversations of women and get them to also break that stereotype that, in conversations that have to do with women, only women will come and have it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shaili, for raising that point about bringing men into the conversation. In our work, we strongly believe at ICRW that gender norms harm men as well, right? We will not say equally, but gender norms harm men. So till the time you bring men into the conversation, do not bring men into the conversation, your struggles are going to remain incomplete, and victories are going to be much more difficult. So thank you so much for bringing that in. Anubha, I'd like to come to you and sort of just ask you that, we've heard that things are changing a little bit. What do you feel? Are things changing? Is there more opening up to covering issues of gender? Is there more space for women journalists to cover issues that are close to their heart? What do you feel? Did you, like 5 years back, think that today the way we are reporting on gender issues, would that happen, or do you think it's still too less, too little?
Sapna, it's funny, if you'd asked me this question a couple of weeks ago, at least as far as the Indian television media space is concerned, I would have said that we've gone to the dark ages or so. So I'll put that caveat and sort of try and temper my sentiment. My perspective is slightly different. I don't think the onus of telling stories around women and gender minorities should rest on women. If the onus was completely on that, we'd have newsrooms far more polarized than they already are. My sense is that this broad arc term that's called mainstreaming gender or covering gender in sort of a holistic way actually has not deep dived completely into our newsroom space. What do I mean when I say that? I believe mainstream gender is an occasional thing that pops up. I believe gender is something that is done more or less in our mainstream newsrooms out of obligation. It is not an ethos. It is not frequent. It is not a core concern. It is a customary thing. It is something that you hand over to women journalists who have an additional interest in gender and quote unquote women's issues. And I think we can never achieve what we are all trying to achieve here in this platform, in this conversation, as a part of this conference, if we continue with some of these thoughts. How is sort of mainstream media or popular media structured in a way? One of it is institutional, right? Who leads teams, who is your executive editor, who is signing the checks, who is the advertiser. The second is sort of the content base of it. What are the stories you're choosing to cover? How are you covering them? Who are you talking to, etc. And the third is what are the value systems you bring out in that coverage? I think it's a mixed bag as far as the Indian media space is concerned. And sometimes we are, each one of us, I'm sure, would be horrified by what we saw. And sometimes we'll sort of pat our backs as far as that is concerned. Now, as far as my own personal experience is concerned, I come from a fair point of privilege. I've had access to good education. I've had access to a very supportive structure. I've also had access to strong networks like what Munizae has built with South Asia Women in Media, networks to a strong sense of solidarity that women journalists are constantly facing. But I think, as Munizae also mentioned, I have kept in my mind throughout my journalistic career that I will not show vulnerability. That I cannot show vulnerability, because if I show vulnerability, I will not be sent, as Munizae mentioned, to either some of the conflict zones, or I would be tagged a sort of weakling. It's not as if, and I think the newsroom is a democratic space in that sense. It's not as if men are allowed to show vulnerability too. So there's no space for vulnerability. The second thing is that I have to admit that in my years, 20 years, I did accept behavior that I would now call out far more openly than I did in my journalistic career. I'll leave it at that. I did accept behavior that I would now normally call out completely and would stand with women who are calling out. And the third itself is sort of the degradation of the media. Now, how do you tackle all of this? How do you tackle women in leadership? How do you tackle what we are covering? And how do you tackle the value systems that we are propagating through our coverage? Some of the coverage in Indian media has gone on to show the worst of stereotypes, the worst of misogynist behavior. And these stereotypes are not coming from the media in a bubble. These stereotypes are coming in from sort of the society at large. So how are we going to tackle it? Can we just tackle it by bringing in more women into the newsroom? I don't think so, because it's a mixed bag. I'd agree with Shaili. Women are today editors in India. They're covering important beats, politics, conflict, business, etc. They're editors. But if we are going to take if we're going to put tick marks to the number of women we see on the screen and feel happy, well, I'm sorry, that's not where success for us lies. I think there's great hope in sort of independent media, and there's great hope in a strong array of independent women journalists who are leading the charge, who are not covering gender as a silo. Gender does not have to be remembered every time there is sexual violence. Women and gender minorities have an agency, have a mind to speak on some of the biggest crises of our times. And that would be sort of true mainstreaming of gender as I see it.
Thank you, Anubha. Thank you so much for raising that. I think I want to just continue asking you, just building upon what you said about how women leaders may not necessarily change the gender dynamics in a newsroom or the way things are operating, but do you think that it will make a difference? Because like you said, I mean, I also don't want to talk about what's been happening in the Indian media over the last couple of months, but do you think that women, because having had the lived experience, may be more sensitive? And even when you look at the way women's issues are covered, they are so essentialized, right? You look at how a lot of channels in Indian media talk about women as bahus, as mother-in-laws, and how they or they're out there to get each other. And also, even just right now, if we talk about what's happening in Bollywood, how women are sort of painted. So, don't you think that perhaps there would be some change, and perhaps it's not enough, but what else does it require? Maybe more women presence, maybe more coverage of women's stories, but what else does it require if not only women leaders?
Sapna, do you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. It does need more women, and I'm not making the case against that. I go back to, I'm sure everyone's heard of that quote by Ruth Ginsburg when she was once asked how many women would be enough in the American Supreme Court, and she said 9. So he said 9, but that's all the seats of the American Supreme Court. She said, yeah, you've got 9 men, and you never sort of blinked an eye. So how many women editors, how many women leading, important beats, etc.? Well, I'd say as many as we can. A critical mass, overflowing, all of that. My only sort of caveat is that women are not a monolith. Women in newsrooms are not going to make the best of decisions always, and we should be accepting of that. I also want to make the point that just a mere seat at the table is not enough. You put one women editor in sort of a big newsroom meeting, etc., well, you'll find that a lot of decisions have been taken in the evening when the men sat for a drink and just sort of decided on the big story. So just one woman is not going to help. You've got to support them. You've got to give them all the information. You've got to build a network. I also think men, Sapna, have to be part of this conversation, and which is why I've made that comment earlier, that the onus of improving this coverage, the onus does not lie on women alone. If you are not including gender in your coverage of any beat, climate change, politics, business, gender, anything, you're not reporting on half of this world. How can that be good reportage? How does that make any sense? It's like, I love the fact that Shaili brought out farmer suicides. One of the big crises in the coverage of farmer suicides is that you don't think farmers are women. You don't think women are farmers, whereas the women agricultural labor force is predominantly made of women.
Thank you, Anubha. Thank you. And just to add to that, our policies for farmers do not respond to women's realities as farmers. So it's about not just in media, but also policy making. Shaili, coming to you, you spoke a little bit about the pandemic and how the coverage of the pandemic has been. There's been a lot of sort of criticism of how the pandemic, the reportage of the pandemic has been very male expert opinion based, right? We had some female journalists who were reporting, but you can count them on your fingers, and 10 fingers would be more. So, what do you think about that? What is your response to this male expert opinions on the pandemic, and you also mentioned right in the beginning.
No, so to me, the pandemic is no different, honestly. 3 years ago, we did a survey in India with another partner on the manuals here, and also on the bylines, as well as expert views that are taken in newspapers or across Indian media. We did it over 45 days and realized that, many panels went without women. Many voices were the moderators were female, and the experts were never female. So I feel that the pandemic changed nothing when it came to finding the expert, in terms of those who went to look for them, including those who were sort of invited on sessions. And this is where I feel that we don't talk about this enough. No matter how many crowdsourced lists we all have made on Twitter, showcasing experts in different fields, whether it's COVID, whether it's any other issue, including media, for example. Last 1 week, I've seen more male sort of experts on Indian media than I've ever seen or known have existed. Well, and you got like 4 of them here, for example, for them to tap into, and many others outside. So I think that's there is nothing that happened in the pandemic that would really change people's understanding of bringing a balance when it comes to gender or intersectionality, on coverage, on conversations. And I think whether it's India or outside, very, very, very few people have made the effort. Increasingly, I feel that there should be a list of academics that should be printed out and pasted outside every single media house who are women. Not only do we have a very large community of South Asian academics all over the world working in microbiology and biology and viruses, some of the top ones are female. Yet we find we will just go for the existing lot of experts on corona. For us and for anybody else who's watching here, one of the things that we need to do as viewers is to question what we are watching and question the people who are shaping that particular editorial, of the evening or the day, and say that if you don't bring another voice, you've got to, rethink the way you're doing coverage. I must add, though, the idea of adding a female voice isn't meant to be tokenism. So we don't need just female moderators, but we also need to recognize that these women aren't there because they're women, because they're academics, they're mathematicians, they're scientists. They have a role to play there. The famous picture of the recent Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee with his wife, when it went out, this was the whole conversation with his wife, right? And I saw, I think it was Economic Times that carried that story, that Nobel laureate and wife, right? So this is how we just portray our coverage at the most credible, most widely read platforms. And the problem here is that we leave this to the lowest common denominator to decide. If the editor is taking a call, trust me, the rest of the team will not forget it. If we leave this out of the editor's purview because it's lesser work, then somebody is going to screw up. And that's what tends to happen. We need a complete rethink at the top when it comes to these issues.
Thank you, Shaili. You spoke about how we should have a list of academicians outside news houses. I just feel, and in our experience, it's been that the moment you mention an academician, a female academician, and a feminist academician, there are so many sort of there's a fear in quotes that should we call them on the panel or not, right? So that's also one of my questions, and I don't know if we have time to get to that, but just I'm leaving it out there for audiences. Is that why are we afraid to hear feminist voices, right? Why are we afraid? I think that's something that we all have to think about. Munizae, coming to you, you're the founder of the South Asian Women in Media Network, and I just wanted to understand, why do you feel that there was a need for a network like this?
Well, I think that women basically, and allow me here to speak a little bit. I know you are not really talking about India and what you're going through, but we are watching from here and with a lot of concern. The women in Pakistan learned a very hard lesson in the 1970s and the 1980s, where we had General Zia. And in 1983, he came out with a law, the Hudud Ordinances, in which he said that the evidence of a woman shall be half of that of a man. And actually, at that time, women lawyers and women journalists took out to protest because all the other political parties had been exiled. All the leaders, Benazir Bhutto, everybody was in exile. And at that time, there was a conversation. The conversation was that should women's rights be just focused upon by women lawyers, by women politicians, and by women journalists, or should we tackle the issue, I mean, the real issue of whether we should have democracy or not? And the conclusion that the women at that time came to was that if you want to make a round cake, you have to have a round pan. We don't have that round pan right now. We have a square pan. And we came to that consensus that it will always be dictatorial forces around the world. It will always be extremists. It will always be vigilantes, or let's say despots, who will not only usurp power, but those same very people would subjugate women too, whether that's the Taliban in Afghanistan, whether it's dictators in Pakistan, whether it's extremist forces in your country. So that is why I say that women's rights is intrinsically linked to democracy, because we have had these spurts, these opportunities for democracy in Pakistan. And we have experienced that whenever there is democracy in Pakistan, no matter how bad that democracy is, how weak that democracy is, women's rights have been given a chance to survive, to thrive, and women have been given a chance because democracy has a way of improving itself. In other, I won't even say, but in, let's say, sometimes you have democracy, but you have a civilian government, but a very dictatorial outlook, like you probably do right now. So I think that that is why we feel that we have to address the question. And in Pakistan, we are really right now addressing that question because we are back to a system now in Pakistan where the army is in power. I mean, we have a civilian government, but basically the army is in power. And we have seen women suffer a lot in the last 2 years. And some of the strides that we had made as women, journalists or lawyers or whatever, we see that being reversed because there is very little priority given to civil rights movements. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to say. I'm sorry I missed your question in all of this. Sorry, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry. uh, I wanted to know uh, your rationale and objective behind setting up the South Asian Women in Media Network.
Okay. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons was because when I started reporting on Afghanistan, I saw how we were facing the same enemy that they were facing in Afghanistan. The same mindset. They were saying the same things. Women should not be allowed outside of the house. At that time, when the Taliban were in power in Peshawar, women billboards were, they were thrown ink on. Women were not allowed to be seen. And I thought, here we have the same enemy. He talks the same language, whether that's Pakistan, India, or Afghanistan, whether that's vigilantes in your group, area as well. But the women who are asking for the same rights have not really, they haven't really joined, they haven't really made a network, they haven't really come together, shared their experiences, and taken strength from one another. And I thought it was very important for women in South Asia to have that strong voice, to learn from one another, to build those networks, to stand up to these people. And I also believe that, there are different ways of organizing yourselves. There is a way of organizing yourself in a nation state, but there's also a way of organizing yourself in terms of the ideology you share with one group to another. Maybe I will have something more common with Anubha sitting right there, or some of my colleagues sitting right there, than with the mullah in Waziristan. So I think that there are communities beyond nation states, and those need to be built upon, and they have not been given that space and time to nurture.
Sapna, I just want to
Munizae.
say that.
Yes, please,
Munizae,
Anubha. Then I'll just come to Jaya.
I just want to say Munizae, her mom, her late mom, Asma Jahangir, and her aunt, Hina Jilani, are sort of icons for not just Pakistan, not just for the women's rights movements, right? Like just about everyone. So we are extremely, very, very thankful for Munizae to have started the Women in Media Network for South Asia. And I have to tell you that if you ever have a peek at that WhatsApp conversation, it's robust, we fight, we engage with each other, we share each other's stories, and we're all journalists trying to cover multiple issues that confront us in South Asia. Just that.
Thank you. I would love to have a peek. Jaya, over to you. I just want to understand your reason for setting up the Story Kitchen, and also how it sort of helps in amplifying women's stories, because there's a question from the audience member that, how can women journalists promote content on women's issues, right? And we'll have to end there, unfortunately, because we don't have much time. Jaya, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sapna. I really feel that this discussion is really vibrant, and before coming to the setup of Story Kitchen, I would like to add few more points on the discussion that we had earlier. I believe that representation matters, but beyond representation, voice matters the most, because sometimes, as Anubha mentioned earlier, sometimes representation is there, but unless we are able to raise our or amplify our voices within the structure, I'm not even talking about outside the structure, and particularly within the media in which we are working, for that voice matters, and collective force is definitely, because sometimes, because it is very difficult to fight with this deep patriarchal structure alone. The more representation, the more voices, the more it gets collective, then the fight for ourselves will also be easier. And sometimes I also start feeling that definitely gender mainstreaming is important in all the content, but there should be some specific contents should also be covered in our reporting as well. And beyond gender, now intersectional mainstreaming, intersectionality is the most important according to our context, and South Asian context is somehow similar, but intersectionality, being focused on intersectionality, and also mainstreaming the intersectionality issue is very important. And in terms of change, like how the change is happening, the ladder, to go up to that ladder and to reach to that leadership position has made very difficult. I wouldn't say it is difficult, but it has been set up in a way that it has made very difficult for women to reach to that top of the ladder. So it is very good to see that how women are coming together and claiming their own spaces. Like Shaili just now, shared how she started this, and Munizae shared about this, and Story Kitchen is also somehow, similar kind of space, that how we claimed our space to amplify our own voices, not only women working within the media, but also how we can make visible women in the media, and also challenge the so-called mainstream media, because sometimes I wonder why all these one kind of issues are called mainstream, why health is not called mainstream, why only politics is mainstream. Sometimes these are the issues I ponder upon as well. So Story Kitchen, we realized, because I worked with the radio station for more than 10 years, and later when I started conversing with women around my neighborhood without microphone, then I started realizing that there are so many stories, even as a journalist, I haven't heard. Because as a journalist, we also have our own kind of biasness that comes from our socialization. And when we go to women, we have our own framework of questions, or what kind of voice would be good fit for our own story. So that was the framework we were applying. And when I started listening to the women, I felt that if we don't create that kind of framework or question framework, if women start sharing their own stories in their own way, then it would be really wonderful stories that would come, and which women feel the important stories are, not us deciding that what stories are important for them. So that was the one reason. And another is, whenever I read history of Nepal, and I think it is almost like same for everyone here, it is always about men. It is always about those in power. How did they conquer, or how did they contribute to bring the country at this level. So I started wondering, like, what did our grandmothers do at that time. Maybe we can start documenting those, and when we document the current stories, then it will definitely be the history, her story, we call it her story as well. And so that was one major objective, and another was to challenge the mainstream media, and also create a space so that mainstream media can also have access to the stories of women, which are coming from the women's perspective. It is not also coming from our perspective as well. So this was the idea, and we started the Story Kitchen. And as Munizae earlier shared, we started working with the women who faced gross human rights violations during Nepal's armed conflict, whose voices were silenced, the survivors of sexual violence, the women who were tortured by both the conflicting party at that time, the Maoist, then rebellion, and the government were in the war, civil war. So we started working with the women, and we have used storytelling for healing as well, because sometimes when we talk about the health, it always comes and end at the physical health, and particularly when we talk about women's health in media, it always ends up in like beauty. If women look beautiful, then they are healthy. And sometimes when we look into the so-called mainstream media, it is always about reproductive health. these many women died because they couldn't give birth. So there are like so many issues to talk about women's health in the media, but it is not going beyond, and women are always taken as, okay, if they are healthy, then they can give birth to the healthy baby. So it is surrounded, and it is framed like this, and this is how we started Story Kitchen. And to mention the pandemic, to give you example of the pandemic, what we
Sorry,
have been doing
Jaya.
is,
Sorry, we're
yeah,
at time, so you just last 10 seconds.
yeah, last sentence. Okay. So there is one platform on social media. We call it Katha Corona. It is Corona stories, and these stories are being published in Nepali, and there are also some English stories on our Facebook page. So what we are doing now is we are just calling the people who are working on the front line and talking with the women and asking them how they are doing during this pandemic. And we are just publishing those stories and amplifying the voices and stories of women, so that it will also be documented as history in Nepal, how women did fight, how women health worker at the front line are working, how female community health volunteers, as Anubha mentioned, Asha, I think Anubha mentioned that. So we call female community health volunteers, and they are at the front lines fighting with this pandemic, disseminating the information to the people. So we are also documenting it, and it is a kind of innovative journalism that we are doing in Nepal through Story Kitchen.
Thank you so much. I hate to cut this conversation short. It has been very interesting to speak to all of you. I just want to end with what Anubha shared on the chat. She said that she's heard a male panelist report about female fistula. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope women get to tell their stories and men get to be a part of these conversations. And when we talk about women's health, let's not just talk about reproductive health, but let's talk about their rights. So thank you so much, each one of you. Thank you. And please do join the plenary session, which is just about starting. Thank you.